The last thing that I want to work with and show you guys is how to combine the two, arrays and objects. So this is why we have our petData.js. Let's take a look at this real quick. In here, I've generated a whole bunch of random pet names, given them random types and random ages as well. Each one of those is an object. You can see it has that exact same syntax. Let's go ahead and space it out so that you recognize the syntax that we looked at before for an object. This particular object has three properties: name, and then the value in this one case is Arista, type, the value in this case is dog, and age, which in this case the value is 7. Now notice we put all those in as strings. I did that deliberately because I wanted to mess with things a little bit. But age could very easily not be a string. It could be a number if we wanted it to be. But I wanted to challenge us a little bit here to deal with the fact that all of this is coming in as a string. The reason for that is that this happens a lot. When you bring in data to a web page, it comes in as all strings, and you have to be prepared to think about that. Inside of here, then, we place this object as the first item in an array. So here's our array. Its first item is this object. Then we say comma, and then here comes the next object, and comma, and so on and so forth, all these objects. None of these objects have names themselves. They aren't called pet or anything like that. They are just located in one of the boxes in the array's pets. And as long as they're all separated by commas and properly delineated by the curly braces, we now have an array filled with objects. I've also taken great care here to ensure that every object has the same three properties: name, type, and age. As a convenience, I've provided another array up here called column names that also has those three properties: name, type, and age. I've named them here, though, not to perfectly match the properties, but to be the sort of thing you would display in a table as sort of a heading in a column. And that's precisely what we're going to do with it. So, let's take this data and do something with it. We have objects, we have arrays, it's time to put it all together. The first thing I want to do, when you've got objects and arrays all working together, you probably want to take them and put them in a table. I'm going to leave all this old data here, but I'm going to comment it out. I leave it in my file just so you guys can go back to it and play with it if you want to, if you weren't able to follow along perfectly. I'm now going to go back to my index.html, and I'm going to give myself an empty table to work with. I want this table to have an ID so that I can pull it out in the JavaScript, so I'm going to call it pet table. And then I'm going to give it a t-head and a t-body. But I'm going to leave them empty. No TRs, TDs, THs. Just like I showed you in a previous example, we're actually going to fill those in programmatically over in our JavaScript. But it's very handy to go ahead and make the basic placeholder for it first. I know there's going to be a table on this page. The data that fills it, though, is going to come from petData.js. So now let's come back here to our index.js and let's do something with that. The first thing we need to do is we need to get the table itself. So I'm going to say my table is going to equal, and how would we do this? It has an ID, which was exactly why I gave it an ID, and we're going to use that to pull it out here. So we say document.getElementById. And then the ID is pet table. And you just might want to double check that to make sure. Go back to the HTML. There it is, pet table. You can even copy and paste over there just to make sure you don't misspell it. Everything you can do to avoid those human errors is always highly recommended. Now let's go one step further. Let's say var table head. How do I get that? I should have shown you this in the previous example. If you remember, what we do is we use the table, and the table has a couple properties on it that allow us to access these things. Namely, I can say my table.thead, just plain old t-head. A table can only have one t-head, so it's simply referred to like that. I also need the table body, and this is going to be my table.tBody. Actually, no, it's tBodies, because you can have many bodies, but I know it's going to be the very first one. Now, what is this syntax? Well, it should look pretty familiar. This is array syntax. T-bodies is actually an array, and I'm pulling out the very first thing in that array. So the very first body, which in our case happens to be the only body. So I'm pulling these things out now because I'm going to be using them a lot. I don't want to just wait or have to do a whole bunch of document.getElements and things like that later on. Now, let's start actually by running this code and making sure we haven't created any errors. I always advocate working in small chunks. So basically I save this. I know it's being executed because I'm in index.js, and index.js is being included down here. And it didn't throw any errors, so good, we're on the right track. ESLint's complaining that I'm not using these yet, but that's okay, we're gonna. Let's go ahead and get started. The first thing I want to do is create the label of column names across the top. Remember, pet data has a handy little array for that, column names. So all I have to do is go through that array and create a cell for each one. But first, I need to make a row that's going to store those column names. So I would say var header row equals table head dot insert row. Remember that function. Insert row has to be given an index of where you want to insert it. We usually do -1, which says insert it at the end. That's where we want to put it. That makes a brand new row in the table. Now I want to insert cells into that row, and I want to do it for each item in the column name array. And I set it that way for a very good reason. I want to do it for each item. So it's time to say column names dot for each. Now what do we pass into for each? Well, it is a function that receives the item itself. We'll just say name, and then the index as well. I could do I. Now I'm not going to need the index, so I'm actually going to leave that off. It might come in handy later, but we can add it later if we find we need it. So all I'm going to do is put on the name, because that's all I need. Now, I'm going to pause here for a moment because I want to point something out. ESLint is going to complain that column names is not defined, and that's actually true. It's in a separate file, and that means that it doesn't know about it. When ESLint runs, it only looks at the current file, as well as its configuration file. If we wanted to, we could actually add this to a list in the configuration file. But I find it's best when you run into this situation to let it know that you're using a global variable from another file. And there is a way to do this. If you go up to the very top of your file, you can enclose between the block syntax comments. It has to be the /* comments. You can put the word global, and then I can say column names. And as soon as I do that, I've told it it's a global variable, and then it will not warn me that it's not defined somewhere. Incidentally, I did something over in pet data very similar. I've declared things here, but I'm not using them anywhere. And so to keep ESLint from yelling at me about that, I marked them as being exported, which means I've exported these to use in another file. And that way it won't complain. If I mess with this a little bit, you'll see it complains that they're assigned a value but never used. But as long as we say exported up at the top, it won't do that. So these are just some little tips to make your linter behave better. So now it knows about column names. We have a name here now. What do we need to do? Well, we need to go to the header row and insert a new cell. And again, when we do an insert of any kind, insert row or insert cell, we have to tell it where to insert it. In this case, at the end again. I want it to be at the end of the row. And then it's going to return it back. So we say new head cell. Then I need to put some things in it. So I say new head cell dot inner HTML is going to be equal to, well, what's it going to be equal to? Name, that variable that I've been provided to in the loop here. So this is a good start. This gives us the header row. Let's stop and test it. If I save, there they are, name, type, age. And once again, we're coming up against the default styling of tables, which is horrible. Let's get some real styling on that. Naturally, I think the thing to use is Bootstrap. So let's put some classes on our table here. Table, striped. Those are my two favorites. Save that. There we go. Now we're looking a little better. They're spread out here at least. We can see that. Still without any data in there, it's hard to see much. One other thing that's happening here, though, is we marked these, they're in the header, or the T head rather, but they're not being picked up as header cells. They're not THs. I've showed you in the previous example, there is actually a way to get around that. You can, instead of setting inner HTML, set outer HTML. And then we would set it to the full HTML string, in this case th, then the value of name, and then a closing th. If we remember to put that in backticks because it's a templated string. If I save that, now they're bold, and so it recognizes, okay, yeah, that was a header cell. Notice it also puts a line under them, which is also a good thing. It does a lot differently to a th cell. Now, outer HTML is a really problematic function. When you do this, it basically destroys new head cell, creates a whole new element, and from here on out, if you try and keep doing things to new head cell, it's not going to work because it no longer refers to the thing that's in the table. So I'd like to show you an alternative way to do this, something that is not new, but brings together some concepts from previous videos. Let's, instead of calling insert cell here, let's just create a new head cell manually. Remember the function document.createElement. All you have to do is tell it what kind of element you want to create, in this case th, and it will create one, and it returns it back right here. I can then say header row, go to the row and say dot append child new head cell. This has exactly the same effect as if I had called insert cell with a -1. And the only thing I have to do now is make sure and put this inside the cell itself. So we can say here header row dot inner HTML, which is a little more innocent of a function, equals name. So it's slightly more lines to do it this way. But now I don't have an HTML embedded in here, and I won't have any problems messing or continuing to mess with new head cell. Oh, excuse me, I have a typo here. This should be new head cell.innerHTML. I hope you caught that. We save this. We don't really see any appreciable change over here, and that's a good thing. It should still look the way it does. So keep that in mind. That is a really handy thing. Now, let's keep going. The next thing we want to do is we want to go into the body, and we want to insert a row for every pet in our array. Insert a row for each pet. So pets.forEach. And here I'm going to give it a function again that receives just the pet itself. So this for each function is getting used a lot. I will stress you don't have to use it. You can do the for loop if you're more comfortable with that. But I really recommend getting used to it. It is ubiquitous. You're going to see it all over the place when you look at other people's JavaScript. So pets.forEach. It's going to warn me that pets is not defined, so I need to declare that up here again. If you need multiple ones, just separate them by a comma. Pets. Now it's happy. And let's go ahead and insert a row. That's always our first step. So I'm going to say var body row equals table body dot insert row. I'm still going to do it that way. You could actually do the document.createElementTr thing here if you wanted to. That would work too. But insert row gets it done in one swoop, and it's actually something that isn't going to cause any problems. Next, well, we've got our pet here. We need to now take all the information from pet and add it one by one as a cell. Now the trick here is pet is not an array. I can't just loop through it and do a for each. I'm going to have to do its properties one by one manually because they're all defined by names rather than by indexes. This is why arrays and loops really go together, but everything else, like objects, doesn't really go together with a loop. I will say there is a way to do this with a loop, but it's a little beyond what we're doing right now. And it's not something I necessarily want you to go off and do because it has its drawbacks. So we're going to do it manually. We need to look at the pet data real quick. We've put down the columns in the order name, type, and then age. So I need to make sure I add the data in that same order, name, type, and age. Order matters here because I'm just going to call them out by name. I'm not going to use an index. So let's say var new data cell equals body row dot, and actually I take this back. I'm going to do it the document create element way. So let's say var new data cell, I guess I didn't have to delete that, equals document dot create element, and this time I want a TD. Let's say new data cell dot inner HTML is going to equal pet dot name. So remember, I'm going through the array pets, and I'm doing it for each item, which I called pet. Each of those items is an object, so I can say pet.name, pet.type, and pet.age. So I'm assigning that to the entered HTML. Now let's append it to the row. Body row dot append child, and the child will be new data cell. And at this point, we could keep going in that manner. Now I'm going to actually use a function to make this a little bit easier to do. I want to write a function that I'm going to use for this. I'm going to put it up, actually, let's put it at the end. Function add cell to row. I'm going to take into this two things. I'm going to take the row and then the data. What I want this function to do is basically these three lines right here. I want it to create a new element, that'll be the TD. I then want it to assign, not pet.name, but data that I passed in to the inner HTML, and then append that not to body row, but to just row. So it'll take those three things and do them all at once for me. This is something I'm going to have to do a lot, so making a function for it really makes sense here. Add cell to row will take the row you want to add it to, and then the data that you want in that cell. Now, how do I adjust this to use that instead? Well, I just say add cell to row. What's the row? Well, it's body row. We just created that. What's the data? In this case, it's pet.name. And then that will go through and do those three things for me. It's going to make a new TD element, set the inner HTML to be whatever I passed in the second argument, and then append that new one to whatever the thing was I passed in as the first argument, which is body row. I can then do this again. I'm going to do it 3 times. Name, type, and age. Those are the 3 things. We got them right here. Name, type, and age. All right, that should be it. Are you ready for this? We save, and there it all is. I hope it worked that well for you, too. We got the nice striping going on because we used Bootstrap. They're all in there. There's quite a few of them. All sorts of different pet types, different ages, and random names for them. So there we have it. This is our basic way to sort of build up a table from an array of object data. We've used an array that contains a whole bunch of objects, and then we've gone through using these for each loops and using a few functions to make our life easier. I'm going to throw some comments in this just so that you have an easier time going through it. Here we are extracting the elements of the table, so we're getting out the table itself and then its head and its body. Here we are adding the header row and then adding names to the header row across that. Then here we are adding rows to the body for each pet. And down here we are adding the data from this pet to the new row. Lastly, we have this function down here. This will add a single TD cell to the given row containing data, whatever's passed in. That's what it does. And so this avoids having to repeat these 3 lines over and over again up here. Instead, I just have 1 line that I call. It saves me a little bit of typing. You can see in the homework we have you doing a lot of this, and you'll have even more things to add, not just 3 things. So this little function really ought to help you.